Welcome to the Near Memo, a weekly conversation about search, social, and commerce. What happened, why it matters, and the implications for local.
Hey everybody, we're back from our hiatus, our roughly 2-week hiatus, and COVID experience for me. And this is episode 134 of the Near Memo, where David, Mike, and Greg talk about search, social, commerce, all with a kind of local lens. And today we're going to be talking about a lot of the new features in Google Maps and whether they sort of cross the line into bloat, whether it's too much, the continued ongoing decline of citations as a ranking signal, and then the new Google Small Business attribute and whether or not that means anything at all or is just a kind of symbolic gesture that Google's making. And so, with that, Mike, you get to open with the Google Maps.
Sure. So they released a new feature in Google Maps called immersive navigation view, and it allows you to preview a route in a 3D environment and include things like weather, visibility, traffic, and see exactly where you're going to go and what it's going to look like in a 3D simulated environment, which is technically a tour de force. It's very cool. I think it's only in 15 cities at the moment. But the question is, why and who does it help? And is it just a kitchen sink approach to maps because they could, or is it reflective of some future, perhaps visual computing environment? Who knows? I mean, it doesn't have much real world use. If you're in a car, you're never going to preview the route. You want have a simplified view of reality to navigate so that you know when and where to make turns and where to stop, those types of things. So it doesn't help car driving. When you're walking, it's not like you can remember, it's like what value you're walking. You can see what you need to see. You don't need virtual reality to augment that. The one possible use case that I could conceive of is in a city when you want to be on a bike and you want to be sure that the route is safe. It may allow you to preview the safety of a route. But otherwise, it's just a fancy feature in a product that starting in, probably 2013, 2014, and maybe 2015, when I wrote an article about how Apple Maps is becoming local's forward-facing brand. Google Maps, excuse me. Sorry about that. Google Maps is becoming Google's forward-facing brand for local. Google has been throwing everything into Maps, right? It's a place where you now they've gotten rid of standalone apps for things like Lens. It's now in Google Maps. They've gotten rid of standalone apps for business editing. It's now in Google Maps. Transactions are now there. You can book hotels, et cetera. All of these things that if you're a local guide and you want to contribute, that's in Google Maps. All of these features are now in Google Maps. Anybody who is even tangentially related to Google Maps is now thrown into this big sort of bucket of platform. And this is a tactic that Google has used historically. They used it with Google Maps initially in their competition with YP on one side and mapping products on the other, MapQuest, Bing, et cetera. They used it with Google+. Now it succeeded with the original Maps and it failed miserably with Google+. The question is whether it's a tactic and strategy that will work for Google Maps. I mean, to the extent that it has worked and kept iPhone users, Apple Map use at bay, that seems to be the case. I mean, we're seeing only 37 or 38% of iPhone users using Apple Maps from our research. And in that sense, it's been successful at keeping people at bay. The question is it when is too much? When is it too much? And will it fail?
I would argue that all these sort of advanced novelty features that Google has in Maps are not the thing that gives it a competitive advantage against Apple Maps. It's the business data, it's the local business information, and to some degree the review corpus, I think. that really differentiates, at least in my mind, Google Maps versus Apple Maps, because I use Apple Maps for everything navigation wise. But recently, in this coming back from this Cinda conference, when we were in Portugal, I relied pretty exclusively on Google because it had all the local business data, which was important in figuring out, hours and where to go and nearby sort of best cafes and things like that. And Apple simply can't compete with that local business data. Now, I'm not going to use some AR tool necessarily. I don't care about those things. And so I would come down on the side. I mean, they're useful in very limited, very isolated contexts, and they're of course very cool. But I would argue that Google, that my position is that the whole UX that Google has established for search and to some degree for maps is now really bloated, just cluttered with too much information. That's my perspective.
Do you think that Apple's less is more strategy with maps can ultimately prevail, at least amongst iPhone users, to get above 50% of iPhone utilization?
It needs the business data, I think. It needs the local business information to really truly be competitive.
David?
Yeah, I had a couple of comments about this. I don't know this to be true, but just postulating that is the back end of this, not the user application, but is the back end of all this sort of real world modeling at all useful for self-driving cars? And is that maybe why, Google had already invested all of this time and energy into that crap, and then they were like, oh, well, we can just release this as a user feature too?
I suspect you're right. I suspect that's exactly right.
So that seems to me to be like the real.
I mean, it's certainly. I mean, it's an amazing feature, but like, it doesn't help anybody as far as I can tell.
Momentary digression.
But you just said like in a car. You said in a car the driver is going to look at all this stuff, but actually a self-driving autopilot probably is looking for signals exactly like this to understand where to turn, and is there a better route that's safer for weather reasons or whatever. They might actually want to use that data. So
that's true. It could be a virtual reality augmentation product.
Yeah, and as far as the sort of battle between Google Maps and Apple Maps, I think for me, the just having been in a situation in a sort of more rural part of Oregon recently, I just want a map that loads faster. In most cases, when I'm on a weak cell signal or a 1 bar type of situation, and if anything, I'm not sure that less is more from a UI standpoint, is better or worse than the sort of quote unquote richer experience or immersive experience that Google's providing. But does it load in 1 second instead of 5? Like that would be a real 10x type of game changer that might persuade me to switch back to Google Maps away from Apple. So,
and Apple, though, to address that, has added downloadable maps, which I found
right, which Google's had for a long time.
Long time, right?
Yeah,
but Apple was always faster when you didn't anticipate a downloadable map. It often worked more quickly in rural environments because it was vector based as opposed to JPEG based.
Right. So that would actually be a useful feature, is like, if the phone sort of predicts that you're going into a bad environment and downloads all of that stuff for you temporarily, so that you do get better, higher definition, both mapping and sort of directional navigation. So I don't know. Anyway, I agree with you, Mike. This seems like clearly in the bloat column for Google Maps, and it's from a user standpoint, its best use case is as a PR angle to say, look how much more advanced Google Maps is than Apple, don't switch. So
it's interesting going forward, though. They've really doubled down on Google Search and Google Maps as the platforms where they're emphasizing features and interactions. They've moved away from consumer-driven apps, other than say YouTube, but for the most part, it's interesting that those two platforms are so dominant, and as a result, I'm not sure they have much choice but to dump everything into these things, right?
Well, I actually think that Google maps is more durable than search and more impervious to disruption than search, notwithstanding Apple's challenge
Well,
to it.
yeah, it's certainly harder to build a competitor in maps than it is to, license ChatGPT to build your own vertical search engine. It's much harder to build a mapping platform. So
Right, exactly, precisely.
there's a lot deeper moat.
So,
Thanks for joining David, Mike, and Greg. To stay on top of the latest developments in local, subscribe to our newsletter at nearmedia.co. We'll see you next week.